All right, welcome to part 3 of our Climate Change 101 series, where I'll be talking about mitigating climate change. If you've watched the first and second videos, then hopefully you have a little bit of a sense of urgency about the whole thing. And my goal with this video is to alleviate that just a little, just enough that you still have that sense of timing, the importance of timing on this, but you see just how doable, just how manageable the climate crisis is. So when we think about mitigating climate change, our question is, how do we slow or reverse climate change? And if we think back to the root cause of climate change, it's the excess of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So if we can stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and remove the ones that are already there, or at least the excess that's already there, that's mitigating climate change. That's what we're aiming to do. In other words, if you remember this graph of the history of greenhouse gas emissions based on country, we need to stop doing this, stop that exponential increase, and we need to reverse it, and we need to remove all this extra stuff that's in the atmosphere. That's the basics. Of course, the devil's in the details. There's a lot here to do. And if you look at this, or even I'll just show you a different graph. If you remember our RCP scenarios, if you look at this red line, this is where we're headed to RCP 8.5. That's a pretty big uptick in greenhouse gas emissions and temperature, one that would be irreversible and pretty devastating to the global ecosystem. So we need to somehow drop from this red line down to this yellow or blue line down here. And if you look at just the sheer size of that, that can be incredibly daunting. And this can turn a lot of people off of climate change. I see this with friends and family and students all the time. They just look at the sheer scale of it and they kind of give up hope at that moment. So I think a better way to think about, coming down off this cliff from RCP 8.5 to down to 4.5 or 2.6 is to think about it in wedges. Think about it in little pieces. Here's kind of a simple graphical representation on the left here of what I was just talking about. So rather than just one big jump, it's a lot of little jumps. So instead of leaping over the rushing Mississippi, you're hopping over, tiny little creeks with lots of stepping stones in them. Far more manageable. So we call this the wedge model of climate mitigation. There are lots of different terms for this. So this is just an example here on the right. There's a couple of wedges about agriculture and forestry, alternative energy, carbon capture and storage, power generation, and efficiency and conservation. You could separate the wedges any way you want to, into demographics, into geography, into sectors or economic areas, however you want to do it, as long as you break it down into more tangible, realistic things, then it becomes much more manageable. I'm going to go through a few of the main wedges that at least come to my mind to give you a sense of kind of the biggest sectors of the economy that can make the biggest changes in order to mitigate climate change. Some of these will be familiar to you. Some of these will be, pretty far on the nerd scale. So I will do my best to make it clear, but also concise for you. An easy one you all should be able to connect with is transportation. You probably drive to work or have driven to work or to school or somewhere. You're familiar with the sheer quantity of cars on the road and planes in the air and buses and trains. So one of the best things we can do is to make our transportation system simply more efficient in terms of the technology. So we should double the fuel efficiency of all vehicles. That's a very basic goal. And that's not, undoable. Is that a word? We've done it in the past. Even if you look at the fuel efficiency of cars in Japan or in Europe, they are miles ahead of the fuel efficiency standards in the US. And every year they get better. And if we add in, hybrid vehicles and hybrid electric and then electric vehicles, those can easily double, triple, and quadruple fuel efficiencies depending on where they get their electricity. So this is something that's totally doable. But given that we're going to double the number of cars on the road in the next 30 to 40 years, making all those cars substantially more efficient is vital. Along with efficiency is conservation. And usually when you want to think of the difference between efficiency and conservation, efficiency is just changing the technology so that you still get the same service. It's just done more efficiently. Conservation is changing your behavior. So maybe you get a slightly different service. An example would be if you want to take a shower. And a more efficient way to take a shower is if you have a really efficient water heater and a really water efficient shower head. So that way you're still taking a shower. You don't notice a difference. You still get that service, but it's done more efficiently. Versus conservation, which would be to jump into a cold shower, wash yourself really fast, and jump out. You use a lot less hot water, but the service has changed. Maybe you don't enjoy it quite as much. So conservation is a little bit more of a change to your personal behavior. But there's so many things in the area of transportation that conservation just makes sense for. And in the US, we have this culture of driving. It's just assumed that whatever you do, you will drive alone in your car to that thing. And other behaviors sort of get, tossed by the wayside. And the idea of biking to work is still considered not fringe, but, not the norm. Whereas in most other countries, biking to work, taking the bus, walking, carpooling, that is the norm, just not so much in this country. So having bike paths everywhere, having good bike shops, having access to good bicycles, having a free bus service and good bus routes, having a carpool system that's easy to use. All of these things change the service slightly for the user, but can make a really dramatic impact, both on our health and on traffic congestion. One of the best things that cities can do is installing traffic circles and roundabouts, because one of the biggest portions of greenhouse gases from transportation is from idling and congestion. So if you're stopped at a stop sign, stoplight, traffic jam, you're just sitting there pumping out greenhouse gases. And then when you rev your engine to move forward again, you're actually putting out more carbon than you would if you were just driving at a normal rate. So putting in a roundabout where you don't have to sit in traffic, but you just kind of get to keep moving at a slower pace can be incredibly impactful. Broadening efficiency out a bit. There's all kinds of ways in which things can be efficient, but mostly we tend to talk about buildings, appliances, and then the grid itself. So there are 101 different ways you can make buildings more efficient. You can retrofit existing buildings. You can build new buildings that are net zero or just very efficient. And it's all about how you use sunlight, where you put the roof, where you put the windows, how people actually use the physical space, how well you insulate it, how much you use the soil around you. It's about being creative with the space that you have. And it's a fascinating field to get into if you're interested in that sort of thing. On the same token, appliances, the stuff we use in our house is what makes up the biggest portion of home energy use, obviously, aside from heating and air conditioning. So if you can buy, a microwave that's more efficient than the typical one, that's a big win. Energy Star, that's what this picture is here on the lower left, is a third-party rating system for appliances. So if you see an Energy Star sticker, it means it's been certified by a third party as an efficient option. In terms of grid efficiency, we won't get too into this just because it's a lot of detail. You got to know a lot of stuff about the grid. But the grid that we have in the country today is based on an old model of really cheap energy sources like coal and really easy access to everything, resources, copper, lines, property. It's sort of based on a system where everything's cheap. And that's not really the case anymore. Renewable energy is harder to work with at times. There's more demand and more fluctuating demand than there used to be. So the grid itself has a lot of room to change and to grow and to become more efficient. Which brings us to renewable energy, which is kind of that's the big one. This is the popular one, right? When you ask people, how do you solve climate change? Everyone says wind turbines and solar panels. And that's true. We do have to restructure the grid, get off of coal and gas and onto renewables. It's not that easy. You can't just replace a bunch of coal power plants with a bunch of wind turbines. They don't produce the same kind of power in a way. So we do need to rapidly and dramatically increase the presence of wind and solar on the grid, along with a lot of rooftop options for solar. But along with that, we also need these ancillary services like storage, because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So you need to collect as much energy as you can when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, and save that for when it's dark or a still day. So storage can do that. Also, smart grid, smart metering, those are just as important in order for the utility to be able to maintain control of the grid, and to be more flexible. So renewable energy is, it is the wind turbines and the solar panels, but there's a lot of detail that goes into it, that's worth looking into if you're interested. Nuclear energy is sort of an interesting one to bring up. I wish I could see everyone's face right now while I'm talking about this, because opinion on nuclear is very varied, even among my students. And the reason nuclear power is becoming more attractive, even after Fukushima and Chernobyl, is that it's one of the few things on the grid that can replace coal and gas. So there's this term I'll throw out there, baseload power. This is power generation that is controllable by the utility. Like wind and solar are not controllable. They just, you have it when you have it and you don't when you don't. But something like nuclear, coal, natural gas, hydro, those are fairly controllable. You decide when to turn it on and when to turn it off. And it's large. And I won't get into the physics of this, but on a grid to maintain stability, you need big generators that can keep spinning when things get wonky. So our baseload power on the grid is primarily coal, natural gas, and hydro, and nuclear. We're trying to do away with coal and natural gas just for the sake of climate change. Hydro is pretty much tapped out. We can't really build any more big dams since we've already built them all. And that leaves nuclear or renewables with a whole lot of storage, which is a very expensive option. So renewables and storage definitely have to happen, but in order to make baseload happen at a big scale, nuclear is one of the few options left on the table. Obviously, there are a lot of fears around nuclear. Meltdowns like Fukushima is a big one. And then waste. We currently do not have any way to deal with nuclear waste other than to bury it underground and hope no one digs it back up again. So investing in next generation reactors that don't produce as much waste, that don't melt down nearly as easily, maybe reactors that even recycle old waste, stuff like that, as well as waste repositories. That would be a necessary investment for nuclear to be viable again. So either way, it's an expensive option to change over the grid. One of the most interesting, we've talked about mitigating in terms of not producing as much carbon through efficiency and conservation and renewables. But one thing we're going to have to think about now that we've already kind of surpassed a lot of our climate goals, not surpassed, blown by a lot of our climate goals, is that we're going to have to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And one of the most efficient ways to do this is just to let stuff grow. Stop deforesting at the rate we're deforesting, and allow forest ecosystems to kind of grow into themselves. So different from a tree farm where you just plant a lot of trees and then cut them down, and an ecosystem doesn't really get a chance to thrive, compared to a fully thriving forest ecosystem that has very deep root structures and the fungal networks and bacteria that help make that network function. In those sorts of ecosystems, you get these really deep root structures and carbon sequestration underground. And you can actually pull a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere just by allowing forest ecosystems to do their own thing. Not to say humans aren't part of that ecosystem. We still log and we still need timber, but there are ways to do that more efficiently and more sustainably. On a similar note, prairie lands and grasslands are incredibly powerful carbon sinks. And modern day ranching and farming practices have depleted a lot of the carbon from the soil, largely for economic reasons. And one of the best things we can do is replenish that carbon in the soil. And that can be done actually fairly easily with a little bit of investment and help from the outside. Ranchers and farmers can change up their practices a little bit in a way that actually promotes soil biodiversity, which promotes carbon sequestration. And you can actually get triple to 4 times as much carbon in the soil than is there right now. And that means better plant health, better bacterial health, better insect and pollinator health, and therefore better birds and all these other things that eventually make the whole ecosystem much more resilient and therefore the ranching operation itself much more sustainable. It also retains water a whole lot better, and you can run more cattle or sheep or goats or whatever you're running per acre than you typically can right now. This is happening right now, actually, in central Montana, outside of Livingston. There's a group of ranchers that are working on this very thing with investment from companies that are trying to zero out their carbon portfolios. And the goal is for those ranchers to try this out, be a proof of concept, and then help their neighbors do this without ever having to say the words climate change, which can be triggering for some people. On the carbon capture topic, we've talked about forest ecosystems, we've talked about grassland ecosystems. We can also industrially capture and store carbon. So if you think of a smokestack coming out of a power plant, you could actually reroute those carbon emissions somewhere else than into the atmosphere. It's not as simple as this funny little picture of a smokestack literally going into the ground, but it's not that far off. You would take all the emissions from, say, a coal plant or a gas plant, and you would inject those emissions into an abandoned oil well or gas well or salt mine, something that is airtight. And you'd inject all that carbon in, you'd seal it off, close the door, throw away the key, and just hope that no geologic process or person comes along and opens up a fissure and releases all that carbon. But assuming all goes well, you can keep that carbon in the ground, or put it back in the ground, I should say. There are also other ways to sequester carbon. A more long-term option is to actually make limestone out of it. You can take that carbon and turn it into something like concrete or limestone, and use it as a building material. Then it's sequestered, indefinitely. There are lots of different options there. They're all hard to do. They're all expensive. Currently, as it says on this slide, we have 3 projects in the country that capture 1 million tons of CO2 per year or more. By 2050, we will need 3,500 of those. So carbon capture and storage is a big growth area, you might say. This might seem a little obvious, but population is a big piece. But it doesn't have to be. I think that's an important thing to recognize. Population obviously has been exponentially increasing since the Industrial Revolution. And for every person, there's more consumption, there's more resources, of course. But if the resources being consumed are themselves sustainable, then we can support a large population. We're approaching 8 billion this decade. And a century ago, we were at less than 2 billion. So it's been a dramatic increase. But the carrying capacity of the Earth is somewhere around 10 to 11 billion, if we do it sustainably. So now we're talking about food systems, energy systems, water systems that are done sustainably, using a lot of the technologies that I've just discussed. So population is a big thing. It doesn't have to be, but while it is a big thing, it's worth noting just how important it is to maintain a lower population growth, at least in terms of climate change. If you are someone who likes to recycle, for instance, which I hope everyone likes to recycle, you might save 17 tons of carbon over your lifetime. If you increase your vehicle's fuel economy, so if you turn in your Ford F-150 for a Honda Civic, you could save 150 tons over your lifetime. If you had one less child, you could save close to 10,000 tons of CO2, just because you're not putting another person on Earth who will consume the same resources at the level you consume them. And I realize the wording here is a little bit weird. I don't mean reduce the number of children as in remove children from the planet. It just means if you were planning to have 3 kids, let's say, instead think about having 2. If you're planning to have 2, think about having 1. And this is on a global scale, not just an individual or national scale. On that note, if you want to put that in the context of all these other sort of individual choices that can be made to reduce carbon, clearly having 1 fewer child is the biggest thing, simply because it's another person consuming. But beyond that, a lot of it has to do with transportation. Don't have a car, or if you do, have a really efficient car and don't drive it very much. Avoid flying if you don't have to. And another really big one is diet. If you if you become vegetarian from a typical US meat eating diet, consumes about 7 times the suggested amount of meat. And if you go from that to a plant-based diet, you more than have your carbon emissions from diet alone. So that can be a huge win. So if you eat a lot of meat, maybe think about eating a little less. If you already don't eat a lot of meat, maybe think about just going plant-based. It's not that hard. My students do it a lot for their own personal projects, and a lot of them end up staying vegetarian or vegan. Again, it also depends on where you get your meat, though. So if you're buying locally from a rancher, and the meat isn't going through this huge carbon-intensive industrial process, that's a different thing. If you're hunting, that's a different thing. This meat-based diet number is based primarily on industrial meat production, mostly on the eastern side of the US. So those are the big ones. And unfortunately, these are the ones we tend to think about the least. Usually when I talk to people about climate change, they're excited because they replaced all the lights in their house with LEDs, or they're recycling more, or they're using a clothesline. And all that stuff is great. It's not the biggest, it's not the most impactful. But I don't want to belittle these things, because these are in some ways even more important to do, because even a small action can make us more likely to do something else. If you replace all the lights in your house, great, to drop in the bucket as far as climate change goes. But if you do that, you're more likely to try something else. You're more likely to try hang drying your clothes, or washing with cold water, or when it comes to buying a new car, getting a hybrid instead, just because it puts yourself in a mindset of thinking about things on a climate scale. And it's more likely that you will inspire people around you to do things. So don't undervalue the little things. The little things are so important. Every little thing you do, it's a police song. Every small action you take is important in keeping that momentum going. But if you're looking to make those like big impacts on your carbon footprint, it's these things on the right that are going to do it. That can feel a little bit targeting. If you look at this, it's easy to feel guilty and say like, oh, I'm not doing that thing, I'm not doing this thing, as if like all the burden should be on you to solve climate change. And it obviously should not be all on you. An exercise I like to have my students do is to take this quiz, which tells you how many Earths we would need if everyone on the planet lived like you. So for example, if you're an American, on average, if everyone on planet Earth lived like you do, we would need 5 planet Earths just to sustain you, just because of the amount of resources you consume or are like indirectly consuming. And this can feel hugely personal, especially if you're the type of person who likes to try to live sustainably and you still can't get it down to 1 Earth or less. And the fact is, you are not acting alone. You are part of a larger society that is burning carbon on your behalf. You have a federal government that has a huge military and a huge highway system and a healthcare system and all these things that are sort of paid for mostly by society for your benefit, whether you use them or not. And so it's not just your responsibility to reduce your personal carbon footprint, it's society's responsibility to change its systems and to change its methods so that we aren't collectively producing so much carbon. So it's good to take some personal responsibility. Think about the personal choices you can make, but don't sit there with the whole weight of the world on your shoulders as if you don't recycle, the whole world's going to end. That's not the case. We are all a part of this. We all need to hold each other accountable, especially elected officials and companies and agencies. So there's a balance there that's worth keeping an eye on. If you want to think about solutions broadly, or just mitigating climate change broadly, I highly recommend looking at Project Drawdown. This is a book, it's also a website. You can just go online and read everything, it's all free. And it ranks all of the things that we can do to mitigate climate change in order of predicted impact. So here I've just listed the top 10. You could go in, there's 100 or more different drawdown solutions. Think of those wedges we talked about. So reducing refrigerants. If you remember, we talked about, one of the most powerful greenhouse gases is CFCs, which is used as a refrigerant. So managing that can make a huge impact on reducing greenhouse gases. Putting wind turbines onshore, reducing food waste, moving to a plant-based diet, or at least a plant-rich diet. And you can go all the way down here, and some of them might surprise you. Educating girls is number 6 for a lot of reasons, and it's fascinating to read about it. So if you're interested in this, I recommend just going to Project Drawdown, checking it out. You know, read about one that sounds interesting to you. So with that, we'll go a little bit back to this urgency issue. I get this question a lot, especially after I talk about renewable energy and how long the energy transition will take. People want to know, how long do we have? You know, how long can we keep doing what we're doing before we've blown past our goals? And there's a few different ways you can think about this. If you think about all the fossil fuels out there that we have not yet burned, but we know about them, we can access them if we wanted to, as in we have the technology and the financial resources to do it. These are called proved reserves. And if you took all the proved reserves on the planet, we could burn 5% of them before we hit our carbon budget, meaning before we run out of room in the atmosphere for greenhouse gases, if you want to think about it that way. Basically, if we burn more than 5%, we will scream past our 2-degree goal by the UN and set in motion a lot of these climate feedback loops that are irreversible. So this means all the natural gas, all the oil, and all the coal that's still in the ground or stockpiled somewhere, we can burn 5% of it and still be relatively okay. But then we have to stop. So if we were to keep going at the rate we're going right now, we would burn that 5% by 2027. So in the next 6 to 7 years or so. If we started slowing down the use of fossil fuels, that timeline would extend a little bit. You know, if we started reducing coal emissions, reducing the use of natural gas, you know, electrified our transportation, maybe we get 5 more years out of that or 10 more years out of that. We could stretch that 5% of fossil fuels a long way if we were running our economy more efficiently in terms of the use of fossil fuels. But that's the only answer I can give you for how long we have. At the rate we're going, we have 6 or 7 more years before we've maxed out. So the question that comes after that is, what if we don't manage to do that? What if we hit 2027 and we're still burning fossil fuels? Or in other words, what if we don't mitigate as quickly as we need to? And it's kind of a trick question, but we'll get to it in the next video, which is all about climate adaptation. So I will see you there.